This is Turd Flinging Monkey for TFM News. I'm going to be responding to an article called Male and Female Brains Are the Same, but People Are All Different and That Gives Me Hope in The Guardian by Deborah Orr. Now, this article came out December 4th, which was 10 days ago. The reason why I've waited to respond to it is I was waiting to get access to some academic papers. More about that in a moment. So moving on from there, the tagline reads, "A new study has given credence to the idea that gender is more cultural than biological. It won't stop the human urge to seek out like minds and avoid unlike ones, but it can remind us that our strength is in our infinite diversity." Now it starts out saying, quote, "A study led by Delpha Joel at Tel Aviv University has shown that there's really not much in the way of difference between male brains and female brains. There are features that are more prevalent in the brains of women and features that are more prevalent in the brains of men, but human brains tend to have a highly individual mix of such characteristics." Unquote. Now, I want to start off by kind of dismissing some things out of hand, and I'll get back to this when I actually get into the academic research. But sexual dimorphism isn't fixed. You know, the idea that because humans are a sexually dimorphic species, and men tend to have certain characteristics in relation to women, doesn't mean every single man is going to have those characteristics. Men are, on average, stronger than women. They have more muscle. Now, does this mean there aren't weak men that don't have a lot of muscle or even have less muscle than the average woman? Clearly not. You see skinny guys, these like beanpole guys around. They're not too common, but they exist. So does that mean that muscle mass is not a characteristic of males? That humans don't have this degree of sexual dimorphism in muscle mass? Clearly they do. It just doesn't apply universally. Same thing with height. Men are, on average, taller than women. Does this mean that there aren't short men? Of course there are short men. So the point is, just because humans are sexually dimorphic, and men have certain qualities in relation to women, it doesn't mean these qualities are universal. There are degrees of sexual dimorphism. You can have a guy who's very muscular, but is also very short. You could have a guy who's very tall, but has less muscle and more fat. And if this variability in sexual dimorphism can apply to muscle, height, and other such things that are more physical, why wouldn't it apply to things that are mental, such as brain density, gray matter, and so forth? Now, as the article continues, it doesn't talk much about the study itself. It goes into this long moralistic diatribe about how people like to put themselves in different groups and separate us versus them, and how this understanding that there's a lot of bleed over between different people, that this is going to bring a better world. Toward the end it says, quote, "But there are times when I feel very hopeful and choose to see human anger and violence as a rearguard action against a growing understanding that our strength lies in our diversity, and that our diversity can only be accommodated if everyone gets to have their say and be heard, and everybody gets to use their own unique brain as well as they can use it," unquote. Whatever, this chick doesn't know what she's talking about. Let's go to the actual research. So the actual paper is called Sex Beyond the Genitalia, the Human Brain Mosaic. It has several authors. The main one is Daphne Joel. Unfortunately, this paper is behind a paywall, so I'll show select sections of it. I can't just upload the entire thing because of copyright. On page 1, section 3, it talks about how, quote, "Joel has recently argued that the existence of sex-gender differences in the brain is not sufficient to conclude that human brains belong to two separate categories. Rather, such a distinction requires the fulfillment of two conditions. One, the form of the elements that show sex-gender differences should be dimorphic, that is, with little overlap between the forms of the elements in males and females. Two, there should be a high degree of internal consistency in the form of the different elements of a single brain," unquote. Now, this is in itself kind of a stupid criteria to base sexual dimorphism on. For example, the first criteria it sets is that the forms of the elements should be dimorphic, that is, with little overlap between the forms of the elements in males and females. That's kind of dumb. You know, when you look at gorillas, they have the same general form. The male is just a lot bigger than the female, hence sexual dimorphism. Now, obviously humans have less sexual dimorphism than a gorilla. Obviously have the same basic form. We're not two different species. We're comparing male humans to female humans. It's stupid to say that because obviously male and female brains are going to be more similar than different, but it doesn't mean they're not dimorphic. Anyway, and then the second one is there should be a high degree of internal consistency in the forms of the different elements of the single brain. So what this is saying is that within that form, so we're looking at female brains and male brains, all male brains should have the same general elements and all female brains should have the same general elements, and they shouldn't be similar. So as you can probably guess, simply by the way that this experiment, quote unquote, was structured, they're obviously going to debunk these. These are stupid premises to begin with in a species. Even species that are acknowledged to be sexually dimorphic are more similar than different, especially with internal organs like the brain. Later on in section 9 of page 1, it says, quote, in contrast, more recent evidence that masculinization and feminization are independent processes and that sexual differentiation progresses independently in different brain tissues. So what this is saying is they're trying to separate sex and gender. Feminization and masculinization are basically this newfangled concept of social construction of gender. So is a male brain, obviously someone who's born a man, do they have a masculine brain or a feminine brain? Now, I'm going to define what they mean in this study in a minute, but this is setting up a straw man, something that they're going to easily swat down and claim something that's not true. What I enjoy about academic journals as opposed to magazine articles and pop culture articles is that they actually have to show their cards. They have to show the data they used and how the data is calculated. And by looking at how they calculated their data, you could find out if they're manipulating the data in some way. And this is no different. So on page 3, it starts out under the results section. It states that they weighted the images of 169 females and 112 males. Now, why did they oversample the females? This becomes important in a moment. They oversampled the females by 57 people, 169 females versus 112 males. This is extremely important, and here's why. Later on, it says, quote, using the actual distributions of males and females in the sample, male end and female end zones were arbitrarily defined as the scores of the 33% most extreme males and females respectively, and an intermediate zone was defined as the area in between these two. We use the term male end, female end as a shorthand for the end of the continuum in which males and females are more prevalent. Respectively, note that our method of categorizing the continuum into 3 discrete classes inherently places some females at the male end and some males at the female end. Unquote. Now, this is where the oversampling becomes extremely important. What they've done, so they've oversampled the women and then taken the results and broken them up into the top 33% and the bottom 33% and the middle 33%. Labeling one the male end, one the female end. And they're talking about gray matter volume, of which men have more. However, because they oversampled women, there's going to be more weight on the lower end of the spectrum, pushing more men into the intermediate or even female categories. So this is how the statistical chicanery happens. You oversample the women by 57 participants, and then you split the results into thirds, which is automatically going to push men down into the intermediate category, or even into the feminine category if they're somewhat low with sexual dimorphism to begin with. Now what's interesting is, despite this manipulation, the results are somewhat consistent with what you would expect had these manipulations not occurred. For example, if you look at page 3, and I'll post a small clip of the page of what I'm talking about, you can see that there are distinct differences between males and females despite the manipulation. This is especially prevalent in figure E, which shows the brain scans of the males and females. Now, if you look at the pink versus the blue and the white, the blue represents the male end, the pink represents the female end, and the white represents the intermediate. You can still see that while there are specks of blue in the female, and there's significantly more specks of pink in the male, there are distinct differences. The females are clearly pink and the males are clearly blue. This is also very evident in figure F, which shows a scattergram of males and females, males being green and females being red. You can see on the left vertical side the males, and then you can see on the bottom horizontal side the females. You can see at the bottom there are some green in the female end, and you can see that there's some variation in the middle. But you can clearly see a norm being generated despite the females being oversampled and arbitrarily divided into thirds. Now, if you go to page 4, and it actually lists the individual samples used in this study, you can see they're all over the place. In fact, the Rothers and Rees sample is almost completely split between men and women. But at the end of the day, individual variation isn't that controversial of a subject. You know, we see weak men, we see short men. Why not see men with less gray matter than the average? I mean, there's going to be variation between men and women. There's going to be variation between individual men. Sexual dimorphism, and especially degrees of sexual dimorphism, affect a lot of things. In fact, I've talked about this before. What's interesting is, despite the manipulation of the statistics and the oversampling of women and the arbitrary splitting of the different thirds, you still see men appearing in one spectrum and women appearing in the other spectrum on average, although there are individuals that are kind of in the middle. But that middle is, by their own words, arbitrary. They say, once again, and I quote, "The actual distributions of males and females in the sample, male end and female end zones, were arbitrarily defined at the scores of the 33% most extreme males and females respectively, and an intermediate zone was defined as the area in between those two." So basically they just took the sample, which was oversampling women, declared that this third were the male side and this third were the female side, and then at the end they say, "Note that our method of categorizing the continuum into 3 distinct classes inherently places some females at the male end and some males at the female end." So it's worthless. That doesn't prove that men and women are a social construct. It only proves that you could take samples, arbitrarily define them, and even despite all this manipulation, men have male brains, for lack of a better word, and females have female brains, for lack of a better word. I mean, these are biological realities. There is variation. There are men with less gray matter, just like there are men with less muscles, and less height, and less broad shoulders, and less facial hair. I mean, there's all these different physical characteristics that define a man. Not every man is going to have these same characteristics. Not every man is 6 foot tall. Not every man is built of muscle. So this whole revelation about there being variation isn't really news. But the fact that they had to manipulate the data so heavily in order to create some arbitrary distinctions so that some feminist author at The Guardian can declare that, you know, gender is a social construct, is just fucking stupid.